When my husband whispered Evelyn in his sleep that night, I felt the ground beneath me disappear. 40 years of marriage, and suddenly I was nobody. After 4 decades of building a life together, raising children, weathering storms, I had become invisible, replaced in his dreams by a ghost I didn't even know existed. My name is Diane, and this is the story of how one word shattered my entire world, and how I rebuilt myself from the ashes of a love I thought would last forever. We met in 1984, Richard and I, at a community college dance in Portland, Oregon. He was studying engineering, I was getting my teaching degree. He had kind eyes, the sort that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and he told terrible jokes that somehow made me laugh anyway. Our courtship was simple, sweet, full of shared dreams whispered over diner coffee and long walks through Washington Park. We married in 1985, a small ceremony with white roses and promises we believed would never break. I wore my mother's veil, something old, something borrowed, something forever. Those early years were beautiful in their ordinariness. We bought our first house in Beaverton, a modest 3-bedroom with a yard where we planted cherry trees that never quite thrived. I taught elementary school. Richard worked for an engineering firm downtown. We had 2 children, Daniel in 1988 and Sophie in 1991, and our lives revolved around parent-teacher conferences, soccer practices, family dinners where we actually talked to each other. Richard was present, attentive, the kind of father who coached Little League and never missed a recital, the kind of husband who brought me flowers on Fridays just because. I remember one particular evening from those early years. Daniel was maybe 5, Sophie still in diapers, and we were having a picnic in our backyard. Nothing fancy, just sandwiches and lemonade on a blanket. But the sun was setting golden through the cherry trees, and Richard looked at me across our children's heads and said, "This is everything I ever wanted." I believed him then. God help me, I believed every word. But life has a way of changing people in increments so small you don't notice until you look back and realize the person beside you has become someone else entirely. Richard's career took off in the late 90s. More travel, longer hours, business trips that stretched from days into weeks. I told myself it was normal, necessary, the price of success. He provided well for us after all. The kids got into good colleges, we remodeled the kitchen, took vacations to Cannon Beach every summer. I buried myself in my teaching, in community work, in being the wife who understood that ambition required sacrifice. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. The way he started keeping his phone face down. The mysterious charges on credit card statements that he explained away as client dinners. The perfume I didn't recognize on his shirt collar that one time, dismissed as scent from a crowded elevator. The nights he'd come home late, shower immediately, claim he'd been at the gym, though his gym bag sat untouched by the door. I chose not to see them. Or maybe I saw them and chose not to understand what they meant, because understanding would have required action, and I was too comfortable, too tired, too invested in the illusion of our perfect life to rock the boat. The children grew up and moved away. Daniel settled in Seattle with his wife Melissa and gave us 2 beautiful grandchildren, Emma and Jack. Sophie went to New York to pursue her art career, living in a tiny studio in Brooklyn that she loved with a passion that reminded me of my younger self, back when I still had dreams that belonged only to me. The house that once echoed with laughter and chaos became quiet, just Richard and me rattling around in rooms filled with memories. We were supposed to enter this phase together, rediscover each other, travel the world we put on hold while raising our family. But Richard seemed more distant than ever, always on his phone, always with one more project, one more meeting, one more reason to be anywhere but home with me. I convinced myself this was normal too. Marriage after 40 years wasn't supposed to be fireworks and passion. It was supposed to be comfortable, steady, reliable. We had our routines, morning coffee together, though he read his tablet while I read the newspaper. Dinner at 6, usually in front of the television because we'd run out of things to say to each other. Weekends spent on separate hobbies, him in his workshop building furniture nobody needed, me in my garden trying to coax life from soil that seemed increasingly stubborn. We were more like roommates than lovers, but wasn't that what happened to everyone eventually? My friends at school talked about their marriages in similar terms, affectionate but distant partnerships built on shared history rather than present connection. I thought we were normal. I thought this was just what happened when the passion faded and real life settled in. I thought wrong. The night everything changed was a Tuesday in October 2024. Nothing about the day had been unusual. I'd spent the afternoon preparing for parent-teacher conferences at the school where I still taught part-time, even at 63, because I couldn't imagine life without those young faces looking up at me, hungry for knowledge and attention. Richard had been in his home office on yet another conference call that ran late. We'd eaten leftover chicken casserole, watched a nature documentary about wolves that Richard fell asleep during, and gone to bed at our usual time, 10:30, like clockwork. I woke around 2 in the morning, thirsty, my mouth dry from the heating that always ran too hot in our bedroom. Richard was beside me, sleeping on his back, his breathing deep, and even with that slight wheeze he'd developed over the years. I was about to get up for water when he stirred, mumbling something in his sleep. I paused, curious, because Richard rarely talked in his sleep. Most nights he was silent as stone, immovable as a mountain. Then, clear as a bell, soft and tender in a way he hadn't spoken to me in years, he whispered, "Evelyn, I love you." The room tilted. My heart stopped, then started again, pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, feel it in my throat, taste copper on my tongue. Evelyn. The name hung in the dark air between us like poison, seeping into every corner of our bedroom, contaminating 40 years of memories in 3 syllables. I sat frozen in bed, watching my husband sleep peacefully, his face relaxed and content, dreaming of a woman who wasn't me. Who was Evelyn? The question circled my brain like a vulture. A coworker? A client? Someone from his past? Someone from his present? How long had she existed in his life, in his heart, in his dreams? And more terrifying still, how long had I been the stand-in, the understudy, the woman who warmed his bed while he fantasized about someone else? If you're enjoying this story so far, please hit the like button. It really helps me continue bringing you these true stories from the heart. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through decades of moments, searching for clues I'd missed, signs I'd ignored, red flags I'd painted green in my desperation to believe in us. Every business trip took on sinister meaning. Every late night at the office became suspicious. Every time he'd been distant during intimacy, every time he'd seemed distracted when I spoke, every time he'd looked at me with what I'd interpreted as comfortable familiarity now felt like indifference, like tolerance, like settling for second best. I thought about our anniversary just 2 months prior. We'd gone to our favorite restaurant, the same Italian place we'd been going to for 20 years. He'd ordered for both of us, which I'd found sweet, attentive. Now I wondered if it was because he didn't really see me anymore, didn't know or care what I might want, just went through the motions of a celebration that had lost all meaning. He'd given me diamond earrings, expensive, beautiful, completely impersonal. The kind of gift you gave when you knew you had to give something but couldn't be bothered to think about what the person actually wanted. I'd given him a photo album I'd spent weeks putting together, 40 years of memories, photographs from every stage of our life together. He'd flipped through it quickly, said it was nice, set it aside. I'd found it later, weeks later, still on his office desk, unopened since that night. At the time, I'd told myself he was busy, that he'd look at it when he had time. Now I understood. He didn't want to look at our memories because they were just that, mine, not his, not really. His memories, his heart, his dreams belonged to Evelyn. By the time dawn broke, I'd cycled through every emotion, denial, anger, grief, numbness, and landed somewhere cold and clear. I needed to know the truth. I needed to understand how I'd spent 4 decades loving a man who dreamed of someone else. But I also knew I couldn't confront him. Not yet, not without proof. Because if I was wrong, if Evelyn was just a name from a dream, meaningless and random, maybe someone from a movie or a book or a passing conversation, I would destroy us over nothing. And if I was right, if there was another woman, I needed to know everything before I decided what to do with the ruins of my life. Richard woke that morning as he always did, groggy and grumbling about needing coffee. He shuffled to the bathroom, came back, kissed me on the forehead, a perfunctory gesture, automatic as brushing his teeth, and headed downstairs. I heard the coffee maker gurgle to life, the rustle of the newspaper, the sounds of another ordinary morning in our ordinary life. Except nothing was ordinary anymore. Everything had changed, and he didn't even know it. Or maybe he did know, maybe he'd always known, and I was the only one living in ignorance. I got up, showered, dressed, went through the motions of normalcy while my mind screamed. At breakfast, I watched him across the table, really looked at him, searching his face for secrets. He was 70 now, his hair silver, lines etched deep around his mouth and eyes. Still handsome in that weathered way, still the man I'd fallen in love with, at least on the outside. But who was he really? Who had he been all these years while I'd been washing his clothes, cooking his meals, sleeping beside him night after night? "You're quiet this morning," he said, glancing up from his tablet. "Just tired," I replied, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. "Didn't sleep well." He nodded, already back to whatever news article had captured his attention, and I realized with bitter clarity how little he really saw me anymore. I could have been anyone sitting across from him. I could have been Evelyn. Or maybe that was the problem. I wasn't Evelyn, would never be Evelyn, and nothing I did or said would change that. The next few days were torture. I moved through my life in a fog, teaching my classes by rote, smiling at colleagues, pretending everything was fine, while inside I was drowning. At school, I taught a lesson on honesty to my second graders about how lies hurt people, and truth was always better even when it was hard. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was living a lie, married to a lie, had built my entire adult life on a foundation that was apparently made of sand. One of my students, a little girl named Maya with braids and gap-toothed smile, asked me during recess, Mrs. Patterson, why do grown-ups lie if it's so bad? I didn't have a good answer for her. Because we're cowards? Because the truth is terrifying? Because sometimes the lie feels safer than facing what's real. I told her that sometimes people make mistakes, but that didn't make lying okay. She nodded, satisfied, and ran off to play. I wished my own questions had such simple answers. I started watching Richard more carefully, noticing patterns I'd never paid attention to before. The way he guarded his phone, always face down on the table, always password protected, always with him even when he went to the bathroom. The vague answers when I asked about his day. Fine, busy, same old, never details, never stories, just deflection. The conference calls behind closed doors that could have been conducted anywhere in the house but weren't. The late-night sessions in his office, supposedly working on projects I knew nothing about, projects he never discussed with me. I felt like a detective in my own life, searching for evidence of my husband's betrayal in the home we'd built together. And I hated it. I hated the suspicion that poisoned every interaction, the way I second-guessed every word, every gesture, looking for lies. This wasn't who I wanted to be. I didn't want to be the bitter, suspicious wife, the woman who counted her husband's smiles and weighed them for authenticity. But that name, Evelyn, it haunted me, whispered in my ear every time I looked at him, every time he touched me, every time he said he loved me. Did he? Love me, I mean? Or had that been a lie, too? Just words he'd learned to say, a role he'd played for 40 years while his heart belonged to someone else? Were our children born from love or obligation? Was our life together real, or just an elaborate performance for an audience that never knew there was another woman waiting in the wings? I decided I needed help, someone I could trust, someone who could be objective when I couldn't. My best friend, Carol, had been by my side since college, had been my maid of honor, had watched my children grow, had celebrated every anniversary with us. If anyone would understand, it would be her. We met for coffee at our usual spot, a small cafe downtown where we'd spent countless hours over the years, talking about everything and nothing. The cafe smelled like cinnamon and espresso, and normally that smell comforted me, but today it just made me nauseous. "Carol, I need to tell you something," I said, my hands wrapped around my mug, needing its warmth because I felt so cold inside, frozen from the center out. "And I need you to be honest with me, even if it hurts." Her face shifted from casual friendliness to concern in an instant. She set down her coffee, reached across the table, covered my hand with hers. "Diane, honey, what's wrong?" "You look terrible." I told her everything. The name in the night, the suspicions, the doubt that now colored every moment of my marriage. I told her about the little clues I'd been noticing, the phone, the distance, the feeling that I was living with a stranger who wore my husband's face. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with every word. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her processing, weighing her words. "Oh, Diane," she said softly, and there was so much compassion in her voice that I almost started crying right there in the cafe. "I'm so sorry, but you need to know for sure. You can't live like this, torturing yourself with maybes. You'll drive yourself crazy." "But how?" I asked, and I heard the desperation in my voice, the pleading of someone drowning and grasping for anything to hold on to. "How do I find out without destroying everything if I'm wrong?" Carol was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "His phone. That's where the truth will be. Either there's nothing and you can rest easy, or there's something and you'll know what you're dealing with. Knowledge is power, Diane. Right now, you're powerless because you don't know what you're fighting." I shook my head. "I can't. I don't even know his password. And even if I did, going through his phone, it feels like such a violation. We've never been those people sneaking and spying and invading privacy." "Diane," Carol said firmly, squeezing my hand hard enough to hurt. "He violated your marriage by bringing another woman into his dreams, into your bed, even if only in his mind. You have every right to know the truth. You've given him 40 years of your life. You deserve to know if he's given those years to someone else. This isn't about invading his privacy. This is about protecting yourself." She was right. I knew she was right, but it still felt wrong, like I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, sneaky and suspicious and desperate. But wasn't that what betrayal did? It turned you into a stranger to yourself, forced you into actions you never imagined taking, all in the name of truth. And didn't I deserve the truth? After 40 years of devotion, of sacrificing my dreams for his career, of putting our family first, didn't I at least deserve honesty? That weekend, I found my opportunity. Richard had a golf game on Saturday morning, an every-week ritual with his buddies that usually lasted until early afternoon. He'd been playing with the same group for 15 years, Tom and Bill and another, Richard, we called Dick, to avoid confusion. They'd have their game, then lunch at the clubhouse, then probably a few beers while they complained about their wives and their backs and the state of the world. He'd be gone for at least 5 hours. He left the house at 8, kissed me goodbye, that same automatic gesture that had lost all meaning, and I heard his car pull out of the driveway. The moment he was gone, I went to his office. My hands were shaking as I approached his desk. This room had always been his sanctuary, and I'd respected that, never snooping, never invading his space. It was one of the unspoken rules of our marriage. He didn't rearrange my classroom supplies. I didn't touch his office. But respect was a two-way street, and if he'd betrayed me, he'd forfeited his right to privacy. Still, I felt like a criminal as I tried the drawers, looking for anything that might give me his phone password. The drawers were mostly what I expected: files, office supplies, receipts, old business cards. Then I found something in the bottom drawer tucked under a stack of manila folders, a small leather journal, the kind with a strap that buckled closed. My heart racing, I opened it. Inside were notes, appointments, most mundane and business-related. But scattered throughout were entries that made my blood run cold. Called E, she sounded sad. Thinking about Chicago, about what we had. Another year gone, another year wasted. The entries went back years, dozens of them, a parallel diary of a life I knew nothing about. But I still needed his phone. The journal proved he was thinking about someone, this mysterious E, but it didn't tell me who she was or how involved they were now. I kept searching, more frantically now, pulling out files, checking behind picture frames, looking anywhere he might have written down a password. Then I remembered something. The safe in his closet, the one where he kept important documents, passports, his will, things like that. I'd never opened it on my own before, but I knew the combination. He'd given it to me years ago in case of emergency, a series of numbers I'd written down and tucked into my own jewelry box. It had seemed romantic at the time, trusting me with his most important possessions. Now, it felt like evidence. My heart pounded as I retrieved the paper, went to his closet, knelt in front of the safe. My fingers trembled as I turned the dial. Left to 15, right to 23, left to 8. Side were the expected things, documents, some cash, a few pieces of old jewelry that had belonged to his mother. But tucked into a folder at the back was something else, a photograph. I pulled it out with trembling fingers, and my world cracked open all over again. It was Richard, but younger, maybe in his early 30s. And beside him, pressed close, her head on his shoulder, smiling at the camera with joy so pure it hurt to look at, was a woman I'd never seen before. She was beautiful, strikingly so, with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders, bright eyes that sparkled even in the faded photograph, and a smile that spoke of intimate secrets and shared laughter. She wore a sundress, something light and summery, and her hand rested on Richard's chest in a gesture of such intimate familiarity that it made my stomach turn. And on the back of the photo, in Richard's handwriting, was written simply, "Evelyn and me, summer 1992. 1992. We'd been married 7 years. Daniel was 4, Sophie was barely a year old. I was home with 2 babies, exhausted and overwhelmed, dealing with diapers and tantrums and sleepless nights, believing my husband was working late, traveling for business, building our future. And all that time, he'd been with her, with Evelyn. While I was nursing our daughter, he was with another woman. While I was teaching our son to read, he was falling in love with someone else. I sank to the floor of his closet, the photograph clutched in my hands, and I couldn't breathe. The betrayal wasn't new, wasn't some recent mistake or moment of weakness. It was old, woven into the fabric of our entire marriage, ancient history that had never really ended, because here was proof that he'd kept her memory, kept her photograph hidden away like a treasure, something precious he visited in secret while I lived my life believing in a lie. How long had it lasted? Was it still going on? Had there been others? Every question spawned 10 more, and I sat there, drowning in uncertainty, feeling the walls of the closet close in on me, the smell of Richard's clothes suffocating me with their familiarity and their deception. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the garage door opening. Richard was home early. Panic flooded through me. I shoved the photograph back into the folder, my movements frantic, clumsy. Closed the safe, spun the lock, praying I'd gotten the sequence right. Ran back to our bedroom, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. By the time he walked through the door, I was in the kitchen, pretending to chop vegetables for dinner, my face a mask of normalcy while inside I was screaming. "Hey," he called out, and his voice sounded so normal, so unchanged, like the man I'd married instead of the stranger he'd become. Game got rained out. Thought I'd come home and finally tackle that leaky faucet in the guest bathroom. Been meaning to fix it for weeks. "Sounds good," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears, higher pitched than normal, too bright, like glass about to shatter. He disappeared upstairs and I gripped the counter, fighting for control. The knife in my hand shook and I set it down carefully before I hurt myself. My whole body was trembling, adrenaline and fear and rage, all mixing together until I couldn't tell where one emotion ended and another began. I couldn't fall apart, not yet, not until I knew everything. The photograph proved there had been someone, but it didn't tell me if she was still in his life, if this was an old affair that had ended or an ongoing betrayal that continued even now. That night, I lay awake again, listening to Richard sleep peacefully beside me. How could he sleep so soundly? How could he lie there, calm and content, while I was dying inside? Did he have no conscience, no guilt, or had he compartmentalized so effectively that he could separate his life with me from his life with her, keep them in different boxes, never letting them touch? Around 3 a.m, when his breathing was deep and even, I carefully reached for his phone on his nightstand. I'd watched him unlock it enough times to have an idea of the pattern, the way his thumb moved across the screen. On my first attempt, the phone buzzed. Wrong password. My heart stopped. I waited, frozen, but Richard didn't wake. On my second attempt, another buzz. One more wrong try and the phone might lock completely, might alert him that someone was trying to get in. I studied the screen, thought about the numbers in the safe combination. 15, 23, 8. I tried them in order, drawing the pattern. The phone unlocked. My heart raced as the screen lit up, casting a faint glow in the dark room. I was in. holding 40 years of secrets in my hands. I started with his texts, scrolling back through weeks, then months. Most were mundane, work-related, messages to the kids, to friends about golf games and dinner plans, nothing suspicious, but then I found a thread with no name attached, just a phone number, and when I opened it, my heart stopped. The messages were sparse, careful, nothing explicitly sexual or romantic on the surface, but the intimacy was undeniable. Thinking of you today. Remember when we walked by the river? I wish we could go back. You'll always be my what if, Richard. You know that. And from the other number, some loves never die. You know where to find me if you ever change your mind. I saw a couple today at the market. Reminded me of us. Do you remember the cherries we bought that summer? Everything tasted sweeter then. The most recent message was from 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. This wasn't ancient history buried in the past. This was now, present, ongoing. They were still in contact. He was still connected to her, still emotionally involved, still keeping her in his life while pretending to be devoted to me. I scrolled further, found emails, an entire folder labeled E that he'd thought was hidden in a subfolder within a subfolder. Inside were years of correspondence, hundreds of messages stretching back decades. I read them in the dark, tears streaming down my face, learning the truth of my marriage one devastating word at a time. Evelyn had been a colleague in the early 90s, Richard's assistant on a major project in San Francisco. They'd worked together for 6 months, long days bleeding into longer nights, the usual story of proximity and attraction. They'd fallen in love, or so they claimed in their emails, though what kind of love builds itself on lies and betrayal? What kind of love asks a married man with 2 small children to abandon his family? The affair had lasted 2 years. 2 years. While I was home with Daniel and Sophie, while I was attending school plays and baking birthday cakes and trying to be everything to everyone, Richard was living a double life. He'd told me those business trips to San Francisco were mandatory, career-making, impossible to avoid. In reality, he was spending weekends with Evelyn, romantic getaways to wine country, walks on the beach at sunset, all the things he'd stopped doing with me after the babies came. The affair had finally ended when Evelyn took a job in Chicago and moved away. According to the emails, it had been agonizing for both of them. Tears and promises and declarations that they'd never love anyone else the way they loved each other. But Evelyn had wanted more than stolen weekends. She'd wanted marriage, children, a real life, not scraps of attention from a married man. She'd given him an ultimatum, leave Diane or lose me forever. He'd chosen me. Or, more accurately, he'd chosen the path of least resistance. Leaving would have meant admitting the affair, facing the consequences, paying alimony and child support, losing the respect of his colleagues and friends. Staying meant he could keep his comfortable life, his perfect family image, his career trajectory intact. So he'd let Evelyn go, told me he was heartbroken about losing such a valuable colleague, and I'd believed him. I'd actually comforted him, held him while he cried, what I thought were tears of professional disappointment, but were really tears for the woman he loved. But they'd never really let go. Over the years, they'd kept in touch, emails and texts, occasional phone calls when he was alone, meetings when his business trips coincidentally took him to wherever she was living. Chicago first, then Denver, then back to the West Coast in Seattle. She'd never married. In her emails, she called Richard the love of her life, her soulmate, the one who got away. She wrote about growing old alone, about watching her friends build families while she waited for a man who would never fully be hers. And Richard, my husband, the man who'd stood beside me for 40 years, who'd held my hand through my mother's funeral and my father's, who'd walked our daughter down the aisle, he'd written her back. He'd told her he thought of her every day, that leaving her was the biggest mistake of his life, that if circumstances were different, if he didn't have obligations, if he could start over knowing what he knew now, he'd choose differently. He'd choose her. So many ifs, so many excuses, so many ways of saying he loved her without quite saying he didn't love me. But the implication was clear. I was the obligation, the responsibility, the choice he'd made that he regretted. Evelyn was the dream, the what if, the life he really wanted but couldn't have. And nowhere in those emails did I see remorse for what he'd done to me, to our children, to our marriage. only regret that he couldn't be with her. Only longing for a different life, a better life, a life where I didn't exist. Do you think I should have confronted him right then, or was I right to wait and plan? Tell me in the comments what you would have done, because I'm still not sure I made the right choice. I spent the rest of that night reading, learning the geography of my husband's betrayal, mapping out a secret life that had existed parallel to our own for 30 years. By the time the sun rose, I knew everything. I knew about the affair in the 90s. I knew about the continuing correspondence. I knew about the meeting they'd had 5 years ago when Richard had a conference in Seattle, how they'd spent 3 days together, how he'd told me it was all business, when really he was reliving old memories with the woman he'd never stopped loving. I knew he'd told her about our marriage, described it as comfortable but passionless, convenient but unfulfilling. He'd said I was a good mother, a good person, but that we'd grown apart, become strangers living under the same roof. He wasn't wrong about that, but what he'd failed to mention to Evelyn was that he'd been the one to create that distance, that his emotional unavailability had driven the wedge between us, that you can't be fully present in one relationship when your heart lives in another. By the time the sun rose, I knew what I had to do, and I knew that the Diane who'd gone to bed the night before, the woman who'd spent 40 years being understanding and patient and accommodating, was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, clearer, done being a fool. But I didn't confront him immediately. That was the old Diane, the one who would have broken down crying, demanded explanations, given him the chance to lie, to minimize, to gaslight me into doubting my own reality, to make me feel crazy for being hurt by his very real betrayal. But the Diane was gone, burned away by the cold fire of truth. The new Diane was strategic, clear-eyed, done being second choice. First, I documented everything. Over the next few days, when Richard was at work or in his office, I took photos of the photograph, careful to get every detail. I took screenshots of the texts and emails, hundreds of them, organized by date. I backed them up in multiple places, email accounts Richard didn't know about, cloud storage under a new password, even printed copies that I stored in a safety deposit box at a bank across town where Richard never went. Then I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but a divorce attorney, a friend from school had recommended once when her own marriage fell apart. Janet Martinez, known in Portland legal circles as the Shark, a woman who specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for getting her clients everything they deserved and then some. I made an appointment for Monday morning, told the receptionist it was urgent, that I needed to move quickly. Then I called Carol and asked her to meet me. Not at our usual coffee shop where we might be seen, but at her house, in private, where I could fall apart without an audience. We sat in her living room, and I showed her everything. The photo, the texts, the emails, the timeline of a betrayal that had lasted longer than some marriages. She looked as devastated as I felt. "Diane," she whispered, tears in her eyes. 40 years. God, I'm so sorry. We all thought you two were solid, the perfect couple. I used to tell my kids to look at you and Richard as an example of lasting love. So did I said, and my voice was hollow, empty of everything but resignation. Turns out we were the example of lasting lies. I'm going to leave him, I said, and saying it out loud made it real, terrifying and liberating all at once. I'm going to divorce him, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows why. I'm done protecting his reputation, done being the understanding wife who makes excuses for him. He chose this. Now he can live with the consequences. What about the kids? Carol asked gently. That was the hardest part. Daniel and Sophie loved their father, believed in the fairy tale of our marriage. Telling them would shatter their image of him, of us, of the family they thought they'd grown up in. They'd remember their childhood differently, would question every memory, wondering what had been real and what had been performance. They'd blame themselves maybe, thinking if they'd been better kids, more demanding of their father's attention, he might have stayed faithful. None of that was true, but children of divorce, even adult children, often carried guilt that didn't belong to them. But they deserved the truth too. They were adults now, 40 and 33, with families and lives of their own. They needed to know that marriage required honesty, that love built on lies wasn't love at all, that they shouldn't settle for anything less than full presence and devotion from their partners, and maybe, painful as it would be, knowing their father's failure would help them build better marriages themselves. "I'll tell them," I said. "They need to know. Not just about their father, but about me, about the fact that I loved myself enough to leave. I want my daughter to know that 63 isn't too old to start over, that you're never too invested in a lie to walk away from it, and I want my son to know what real betrayal looks like so he never does this to his own wife." Monday morning, I met with Janet Martinez in her office downtown. She was younger than I expected, maybe 45, impeccably dressed in a sharp suit with eyes that saw everything and forgave nothing. I liked her immediately. I laid out everything, the evidence, the timeline, the photo, the correspondence. She listened without interrupting, making notes on a legal pad, her expression growing more satisfied with every detail. "Patterson," she said when I finished, "I want you to know that you have an excellent case. Adultery, even if it's primarily emotional rather than physical, is still grounds for divorce in Oregon, and it can affect the distribution of assets. After 40 years of marriage, you're entitled to half of everything anyway, but with this kind of evidence, we can argue for more. We can also make sure that his behavior becomes part of the public record, which will matter if he tries to play the victim or paint you as the unreasonable party." "I don't want revenge," I said, though as the words left my mouth, I realized they weren't entirely true. I did want revenge, or if not revenge exactly, then justice, accountability, consequences for 40 years of lies. I just want what's fair, and I want to be free. "Then that's what will get you," Janet said, and she smiled, a shark smile that made me glad she was on my side. "Here's what we're going to do." Over the next hour, she outlined the strategy. We'd file for divorce immediately, citing irreconcilable differences initially, holding the adultery evidence in reserve. We'd freeze joint accounts, prevent Richard from moving money or hiding assets. We'd get a full accounting of everything we owned, the house, the retirement accounts, the investments, the vacation property in Seaside we'd bought 10 years ago and barely used. We'd calculate what 40 years of marriage was worth and make sure I got every penny. But more importantly, we'd prepare for Richard to fight back. Men like him, Janet explained, men who'd gotten away with lies for decades. They didn't go quietly. He'd feel entitled to his secrets, would be furious that I'd invaded his privacy, would probably try to turn the kids against me or paint me as unstable. We needed to be ready for all of it. That week was surreal. I went home each day and pretended everything was normal. I cooked dinner, made small talk, smiled when appropriate, all while knowing I was about to blow up our entire lives. Richard noticed nothing. He was the same as always, distracted, distant, going through the motions of marriage while his heart lived elsewhere. It was almost funny how completely oblivious he was, how convinced he was that his secrets were safe. That Sunday, I invited both children to dinner. I told them I needed to talk to them about something important, that they should bring their families, that it couldn't wait. I saw the worry in their faces when they agreed, the way they exchanged glances with their spouses, wondering what could be so urgent. They probably thought I was sick, that I was about to deliver some terrible diagnosis. I wish it had been that simple. They arrived at 5, Daniel and Melissa with Emma and Jack, Sophie with her boyfriend Marcus, a sweet guy who worked in marketing and treated my daughter like she hung the moon. We all gathered around the dining room table, the table where we'd celebrated thousands of meals, birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays, the table that held so many memories, most of them lies. After dinner, after the grandchildren had been sent to play in the den with tablets and toys to keep them occupied, I looked at my adult children across the table and said, "There's something you need to know about your father and me, about our marriage, about the life you thought you knew." Richard's face went pale. He knew, somehow, that the reckoning had come. "Diane," he said, his voice low, warning, "let's talk about this privately first." "No," I said, and my voice was steel. "We've had 40 years of private conversations, or rather, 40 years of you lying and me believing. The children deserve to know the truth. They deserve to understand what real betrayal looks like so they can build better marriages than the one we had." I told them everything, showed them the photograph, read them excerpts from the emails, explained the timeline. showed them proof that their father had been in love with another woman for their entire lives, that our marriage had been a convenient fiction, that everything they'd believed about their family was built on lies. Sophie started crying immediately, her face crumpling like she was 8 years old again instead of 33. Marcus put his arm around her, held her while she sobbed, and I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not until she understood everything. Daniel's face went hard, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. He stared at his father with an expression I'd never seen before, pure disgust mixed with devastation. He'd idolized Richard growing up, wanted to be just like him. Now he was learning his hero was a fraud. "How could you?" Daniel finally said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Mom gave you everything. She raised us while you worked. She gave up her career ambitions to support yours. She made every birthday special, every Christmas magical, every family dinner a priority. And this is how you repaid her? By dreaming of someone else? By keeping another woman in your heart while Mom slept beside you every night?" "It's not what you think," Richard said, and his voice was desperate, pleading. "Evelyn, it was complicated. I never meant to hurt anyone." "I love your mother. I've always loved her. Evelyn was a mistake, a moment of weakness that I've regretted every day since." "Then why do you still have her photograph?" I asked coldly. "Why have you been emailing her for 30 years? Why did you meet her in Seattle 5 years ago? Why does your last text to her say you'll always be my what if?" "That doesn't sound like regret, Richard. That sounds like longing. That sounds like love for her and resignation to me." Sophie's sobs got louder. Melissa looked shocked, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. Marcus held Sophie tighter. And Daniel, my strong son who'd served in the Marines and rarely showed emotion, had tears running down his face. "I defended you," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "When my buddies complained about their fathers, about their cheating, their drinking, their absence, I told them I was lucky. I told them you were different, that you showed up, that you loved Mom, that you proved marriage could work. And it was all a lie." "No," Richard tried to say, but Daniel cut him off. "Yes, it was a lie. Maybe you were physically present, but you were never emotionally here. You were always somewhere else, with someone else in your heart, and Mom deserved better. We all deserved better." Richard turned to me then, desperation written across his face. "Diane, please, can we talk about this privately? I know I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but we can work through this." 40 years means something. Our family means something. Don't throw it all away. "I'm not throwing it away," I said quietly. "You did. 40 years ago when you chose to have an affair. 30 years ago when you decided to keep Evelyn in your life instead of cutting her off completely. 5 years ago when you lied about Seattle. 2 weeks ago when you texted her again. Every single day that you let me believe our marriage was real while you dreamed of someone else. You threw us away, Richard. I'm just finally accepting that reality." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Sophie spoke, her voice small and broken. "I don't understand, Daddy. Why? If you loved her so much, why didn't you just leave? Why did you stay and make us all live in a lie?" Richard looked at our daughter, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw him completely exposed, all his masks stripped away. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because leaving would have meant admitting what I'd done, facing consequences, being judged. Because staying was easier. Because I thought I could have both, a comfortable family life and the memory of a great love. I was wrong. I hurt everyone, and I don't know how to fix it." "You can't," I said. "Some things are too broken to repair. But you can do the right thing now. You can cooperate with the divorce. You can give me what I'm entitled to without a fight. You can let me go with some dignity instead of dragging us both through the mud." The kids left shortly after, both making it clear they needed time before they could talk to their father again. Sophie was still crying when Marcus led her to the car. Daniel hugged me tight before he left, whispered in my ear, "I'm proud of you, Mom. It takes courage to start over." Those words meant everything. Richard and I were left alone in the house that suddenly felt enormous and empty. He tried to talk to me, to explain, to bargain, but I was done listening. I told him I was sleeping in the guest room, that I'd filed for divorce, that my lawyer would be in contact with his. I told him if he wanted to salvage any dignity or respect, he'd cooperate, give me what I deserved without a fight. Otherwise, I'd make sure everyone we knew, everyone in his professional circle, everyone at the country club, everyone at church, knew exactly what kind of man he was. His face crumbled. Please, Diane. 40 years. Don't we owe it to ourselves to try? To see a counselor? To work through this? What would we work through? I asked. The fact that you've loved someone else our entire marriage? The fact that I'm the obligation you settled for? The fact that every time you made love to me, you were probably thinking of her? No amount of counseling can fix that, Richard. You can't therapize away 3 decades of betrayal. It wasn't 3 decades, he said weakly. The affair only lasted 2 years. The rest was just memories, emails. I never physically cheated on you after she moved away. I laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. You think that makes it better? You think emotional infidelity is less damaging than physical? You were never really mine, Richard. Not your heart, not your mind, not your dreams. You gave me your physical presence and called it love. But it wasn't love. It was convenience. It was cowardice. And I'm done accepting scraps and calling them a feast. That night, I slept in the guest room for the first time in 40 years. The bed was unfamiliar, the mattress too firm, the room too cold. But I slept deeply, dreamlessly, the sleep of someone who'd finally stopped carrying a burden that was never hers to bear. I woke up the next morning feeling lighter than I had in years. The divorce proceedings were exactly as Janet had predicted, swift and brutal. My evidence was ironclad. Richard's lawyer took one look at the photos, the texts, the emails, and advised him to settle. Richard tried to fight at first, hired an expensive attorney, made noises about how the affair was ancient history, how I was overreacting, how surely we could work this out without destroying our finances. But when Janet made it clear she was prepared to subpoena Evelyn, to depose her, to put every intimate detail of their relationship into the public record, to make his infidelity the subject of open court proceedings where his colleagues and friends could attend and bear witness, he folded like a cheap suit. We split everything down the middle, which meant I got half the house, half the retirement accounts, half the savings, all of it divided with mathematical precision. I could have pushed for more, Janet said, could have argued that his betrayal entitled me to greater compensation, but I didn't want more of his money. I just wanted my fair share and my freedom. I wanted to walk away clean, owing him nothing, with my dignity intact. The legal proceedings took 6 months, 6 months of negotiations and paperwork and dividing up 40 years of accumulated stuff. Who got the wedding china? Who kept the photos? How do you split a lifetime of memories when half of them were lies? In the end, I took very little, just a few pieces of furniture I'd always loved. My grandmother's antique desk, the painting we'd bought on our trip to Santa Fe, the Christmas ornaments the kids had made when they were little. Richard got to keep the house, that monument to our failed marriage. I didn't want it anymore, didn't want to live surrounded by ghosts and lies. Let him rattle around in those empty rooms haunted by what he'd destroyed. The kids struggled with everything. Sophie stopped talking to Richard for months, and when she finally did agree to see him, it was tense and formal, the easy affection between them destroyed. She came to visit me in my new place, looked around at my tiny apartment, and started crying again. I feel like my whole childhood was a lie, she said. Every happy memory I have now has this shadow over it. Every family dinner, every Christmas morning, every time you guys said you loved each other, I wonder if it was real or just performance. I held her and told her that my love for her had always been real, that she and Daniel were the best things I'd ever done, that even if the marriage had been built on lies, the family we created together was genuine. I hoped she believed me. I hoped someday it would be true for her again. Daniel was coldly polite to Richard, allowing supervised visits with the grandkids, but making it clear that trust, once broken so completely, could never be fully repaired. He told me privately that he'd had a long talk with Melissa about their own marriage, about honesty and presence and the importance of really seeing each other. If nothing else good came from this disaster, maybe at least my son would build a better marriage because of the example of how not to do it. The divorce was finalized in April 2025, 6 months after that terrible Tuesday night when my world had changed. I signed the papers in Janet's office, my hand steady, feeling lighter with every stroke of the pen. When it was done, when I was officially no longer Mrs. Richard Patterson but just Diane Walsh again, my maiden name reclaimed like a piece of my identity I'd lost decades ago, I walked out of that building into bright spring sunshine and realized I was smiling. I was 64 years old, suddenly single after 4 decades of marriage, and I had no idea what came next. But for the first time in years, decades maybe, I felt alive, truly alive, not just going through the motions but actually present in my own life. The future was a blank page, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I sold my half of the house back to Richard, couldn't bear to live in a space so saturated with memories, both real and false, and used the money to buy a small condo downtown. It was in an old converted warehouse with exposed brick walls, huge windows that let in floods of natural light, and a view of the Willamette River that took my breath away every single morning. I redecorated it in colors I loved, bright blues and teals and greens, nothing neutral or careful or chosen to match someone else's taste. I hung art I found at local galleries, filled the bookshelves with novels I'd never had time to read, created a space that was entirely, unapologetically mine. My new home was small, maybe a quarter the size of the house Richard and I had shared, but it felt bigger somehow, full of possibility rather than weighed down by history. Every corner held potential instead of painful memories. I could walk from room to room without seeing ghosts of family dinners and false anniversaries. I kept teaching, found I loved it more than ever now that it wasn't just something to fill my time, but a choice I made because it mattered to me. The children at school became my joy, their energy and curiosity and endless questions reminding me that life was still full of wonder if you paid attention. I started a program for struggling readers, volunteered to tutor after school, threw myself into education with the passion I'd had as a young teacher before marriage and motherhood had consumed all my energy. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with over the years, women from college and early teaching days who drifted away as we'd all gotten busy with our own lives. I joined a book club, started taking painting classes at the community center. I discovered I had a knack for watercolors, something about the way the colors bled and blended speaking to the mess and beauty of transformation. My paintings weren't technically perfect, but they were honest, emotional, raw, and I loved them. One of my paintings, a sunset over the river done in shades of orange and purple that looked like fire and healing all at once, won a ribbon at a local art show. It was a small thing, just a 4th place ribbon in the amateur category, but I cried when they announced it. At 64 years old, I was still capable of creating something beautiful, still capable of surprising myself. That felt like proof that life wasn't over, that there were still firsts waiting to be discovered. Sophie came to visit me in my new place about a year after the divorce, and we sat on my tiny balcony drinking wine and watching the sunset paint the river gold. She'd been to therapy, worked through a lot of her anger and confusion, and was slowly rebuilding her relationship with Richard. I was glad for that, even though my own relationship with him consisted of nothing more than brief, civil emails about logistics involving the kids. "Mom," Sophie said quietly, swirling the wine in her glass, "I'm sorry I didn't see it. What you were going through all those years. I thought you were happy. I thought you guys were the example everyone should follow." I thought I was happy too, I told her honestly. Or maybe I convinced myself I was because the alternative was too scary to face. It's easy to settle for okay when you don't realize that you deserve extraordinary. But Sophie, I'm happy now. Really happy. Not the comfortable, settled happiness of routine, but the wild, surprising happiness of discovering yourself all over again. She smiled, reached over and squeezed my hand. "You're different now, lighter somehow, like you're more you than you were before." "I'm free," I said simply. For the first time in my adult life, I'm free. Free from the weight of someone else's lies. Free from trying to be enough for someone who'd already decided I wasn't. Free to just be Diane, whoever that turns out to be. I heard through mutual friends, people we'd known as a couple who'd navigated the awkwardness of choosing sides or trying to stay neutral, that Richard eventually reconnected with Evelyn. She moved to Portland about 8 months after our divorce was finalized, and they're living together now in a townhouse in the Pearl District, finally getting their second chance or their first real chance, depending on how you looked at it. Part of me thought I'd feel jealous or angry about that, but I didn't. I felt nothing, just a vague sense of relief that he was someone else's problem now, someone else's disappointment waiting to happen. Because here's what I learned in therapy, something my own counselor helped me understand. People don't change. Richard would probably do to Evelyn what he did to me eventually. Find someone new to pine for, keep his heart divided, prove himself incapable of the full presence real love requires. Or maybe they'd be happy together. Maybe they were truly soulmates who'd been separated by circumstances and bad timing. Either way, it wasn't my concern anymore. Because here's what I learned through all of this. Betrayal only has power over you if you let it define you. Richard's choices were his own, his failures, his losses. They didn't diminish me unless I let them. And I refused to let them. I'd spent 40 years being someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's teacher, defining myself by my relationships to other people. Now I was learning to be just Diane, whoever that was, whatever that meant. And it turned out that Diane, on her own, was pretty interesting. I started traveling, small trips at first, weekend getaways to Seattle to visit Daniel and his family, longer trips as I grew braver. I went to San Francisco and walked along the waterfront. The same waterfront where Richard and Evelyn had probably walked during their affair, and I reclaimed that city for myself. I went to the wine country and took a painting class at a vineyard, spent a week capturing the rolling hills and neat rows of grapevines and watercolor and learning to appreciate my own company. Then, for my 65th birthday, I did something that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. I booked a trip to Paris, alone. Just me and a suitcase and a guidebook and the ghost of every dream I'd deferred for 40 years. I'd always wanted to go to Paris. Richard had always said we'd go someday, for our anniversary, for a special occasion, when the time was right. But the time had never been right. There'd always been something else. The kids' college tuition, the house renovation, his work schedule, his lack of interest in traveling to places where he didn't speak the language. Looking back, I wonder if he'd ever really intended to take me, or if Paris had been another empty promise, another way of keeping me hoping for a future that would never come. But I went without him. I spent 2 weeks in Paris in the spring of 2026, and it was everything I'd imagined and more. I stayed in a small hotel in the Marais, walked along the Seine every morning before the tourists woke up, visited the Louvre and the Musée d'Orsay, and stood in front of paintings that made me cry with their beauty. I ate croissants in sidewalk cafes, drank wine at outdoor bistros, attempted conversations in my terrible high school French, and laughed at myself when I mixed up the words for chicken and horse. I felt young in Paris, younger than I had in decades. Not young in the sense of being naive or inexperienced, but young in the sense of being open to possibility, hungry for experience, eager to learn and grow and see new things. I felt alive. And I met someone there, actually, in a bookstore in the Latin Quarter. His name was Jean-Luc, and he was a retired literature professor, a widower who'd lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier. We reached for the same book, an English translation of a French poet I'd been wanting to read, and our hands touched and we both laughed at the cliché of it. We started talking, and what was supposed to be a brief conversation turned into coffee, then lunch, then dinner, then spending the rest of my trip exploring the city together. He showed me his Paris, the hidden gardens and quiet corners tourists never found, the best bookstores and the bakery that made the perfect tarte tatin. We talked about everything, books and art and loss and transformation, and he listened when I told him about my divorce in a way that Richard had never really listened to anything I said. Nothing romantic happened during that first trip. We were both too old and careful for that, too scarred by our pasts to rush into anything. But we became friends, exchanged email addresses, promised to stay in touch, and we did. We emailed regularly, long, thoughtful messages about what we were reading and thinking, video called once a week, built a friendship that felt precious because it was chosen, not obligated, based on genuine connection rather than shared history. Jean-Luc visited Portland the following fall, and I showed him my city the way he'd shown me his. We went to Powell's bookstore and spent hours browsing. We hiked in Forest Park and along the Columbia River Gorge. We visited art galleries and ate at food carts and watched the sunset from my balcony. And somewhere during his visit, without either of us quite acknowledging it, our friendship shifted into something more. I'm not sure what to call what we have now. Relationship feels too formal, romance too frivolous for people our age. But it's something good, something that makes me smile when my phone buzzes with a message from him, something that makes me excited to plan my next trip to Paris or his next trip here. He doesn't replace Richard, doesn't fill a void left by my ex-husband because I don't have a void anymore. I'm whole on my own. But Jean-Luc adds to my life, enhances it, brings joy and companionship and intellectual stimulation and, yes, romance, even at 66 years old. We move slowly, carefully, both of us aware that we're building something from the ground up, something that needs a solid foundation if it's going to last. And if it doesn't last? If we're just meant to be a chapter in each other's stories rather than the ending, that's okay too, because I've learned that love doesn't have to last forever to matter, that connection doesn't have to be eternal to be valuable. I've learned to appreciate what I have while I have it, without clinging so tightly that I crush the life out of it. My relationship with my children has deepened in ways I never expected. They see me now as a person, not just their mother, and they've told me how proud they are of my courage, my refusal to settle for less than I deserved. Daniel calls me regularly now, not just to check in but to really talk, to ask my advice about his own marriage, to tell me about his struggles and triumphs at work. We have a relationship as adults now, something that couldn't exist when I was still playing the role of perfect mother in a perfect family. Sophie and I have become even closer. She brings her art to show me, asks for feedback, values my opinion in a way she didn't when she thought of me as just her mom who taught elementary school. Last month, she told me she'd been inspired by my transformation, to take her own art more seriously, to stop treating it as a hobby and start pursuing gallery representation. She had her first solo show in November, and it was extraordinary, powerful paintings that explored themes of identity and transformation and breaking free from expectations. I cried at the opening, so proud of her, so grateful that my leaving had somehow given her permission to pursue her own dreams more fully. Even my relationship with Richard has found a kind of peace, though we rarely interact directly. He sends cards on my birthday and Christmas, brief notes that say he hopes I'm well, that he's sorry for what he did, that he wishes things had been different. I don't respond. There's nothing left to say, but I don't feel anger anymore when I see his handwriting, just a kind of distant sadness for what might have been if he'd been capable of the honesty and presence that real love requires. Through mutual friends, I've heard that his relationship with Evelyn isn't quite the fairy tale they'd expected. Turns out that 40 years of pining from a distance doesn't necessarily translate into happiness when you're actually living together. They argue about money, about his adult children who haven't fully accepted her, about the fact that the fantasy they built in their heads doesn't match the reality of daily life with all its mundane irritations. I don't take pleasure in that exactly, but I do feel validated. Their love, built on betrayal and deception, was never as pure and perfect as he'd made it seem in those emails. I'm 66 now, teaching part-time, painting regularly, traveling when I can, building a life I could never have imagined when I was that young woman walking down the aisle in my mother's veil, believing in forever. People sometimes ask if I regret leaving, if I wish I'd stayed and tried to work it out, if I threw away 40 years over something that might have been forgivable. And I tell them this. I didn't throw away 40 years. I reclaimed them. Every year I stay in this new life, whole and happy and free, is a year that justifies the pain it took to get here. Would I do it again, knowing what I know now? Would I marry Richard? Have my children live that life? Yes, because that life gave me Daniel and Sophie, gave me memories and lessons and the strength I didn't know I had. My children are the greatest gift of my life, and I wouldn't trade them for anything. But would I stay after learning the truth? Not for a single day more. Sometimes people need to lose you to understand your value, and sometimes you need to lose them to understand your own. I tell my story now to other women, friends who confide in me about their own marriages, their own doubts, their own moments of wondering if they're crazy for sensing something's wrong. I tell them to trust their instincts, to value themselves enough to demand truth, to know that it's never too late to start over. I've become an unofficial counselor to women at my school, teachers going through divorces or struggling in unfulfilling marriages, women who see something in me that gives them hope. One teacher, a woman named Patricia who's 52 and has been unhappy in her marriage for years, told me recently, "You gave me permission to want more, Diane." I spent so long thinking that okay was enough, that I should be grateful for a husband who doesn't hit me, who provides financially, who shows up to family events. But you showed me that showing up isn't enough, that I deserve someone who's really present, who chooses me every day, who loves me with their whole heart instead of just part of it. She filed for divorce last month. I don't know if that was the right choice for her, but I know she made it from a place of self-respect rather than self-abandonment, and that matters. Because here's what I know now, that I wish I'd known. At 25, at 35, at 55, you are not defined by someone else's love or lack of it. You are not diminished by someone else's betrayal. You are not required to carry someone else's secrets or protect someone else's lies. Your life is yours, and you get to decide what you'll accept and what you'll walk away from. Richard gave me 40 years of partial truths and half-hearted devotion. But in the end, he gave me something more valuable. He gave me a reason to leave, to rebuild, to discover that I was stronger and braver and more capable than I'd ever imagined. He gave me myself back. So did I do the right thing? Tell me what you think in the comments. Would you have stayed and tried to work it out, or would you have walked away like I did? Have you ever felt invisible in your own life, second choice, the obligation someone settled for instead of the person they really wanted? And if so, what did you do about it? If you're going through something similar, if you've discovered betrayal or felt the ground shift beneath you, if you've realized that the life you thought you had was built on lies, know this: you will survive it. You will be okay. And if you're brave enough to choose yourself, to walk through the fire and come out the other side, you might discover that okay isn't enough anymore, that you deserve extraordinary, and that it's never ever too late to claim it. I'm living proof that 64 is not too old to start over, to rediscover joy, to build a life that's authentically yours. My children are thriving, building their own honest relationships. My friendships are deeper, built on authenticity rather than maintaining appearances. My days are fuller, not with obligations but with choices. And my heart, broken as it was, has healed stronger than before, with room now for real love based on presence and honesty rather than convenience and lies. Evelyn may have been in Richard's dreams, but I'm wide awake now, living my own dream, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Not for the security of that marriage, not for the comfort of that lie, not even to erase the pain of discovery. Because that pain led me here, to this life, to this version of myself that I actually like, maybe even love. I'm dating Jean-Luc, painting watercolors that sometimes capture what I'm feeling when words fail, teaching children who remind me daily that life is full of wonder, and planning my next adventure. Next spring, Jean-Luc and I are going to Italy together, to Florence and Rome and the Amalfi Coast, and I can hardly wait. Not just for the trip itself, but for the fact that I get to experience it, that I chose freedom and possibility over the prison of a comfortable lie. That's what I want you to understand if you take anything from my story. Comfortable lies will kill your soul slowly, day by day, year by year, until you wake up one morning and realize you've disappeared, become invisible even to yourself. Truth, even painful truth, sets you free. It hurts like hell at first, but on the other side of that pain is a life that's actually yours, authentically and completely. If you liked this story, hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to get more stories from me. I share these stories not because I enjoy reliving the pain, but because if even one person reads this and finds the courage to choose themselves, to demand honesty, to leave a situation that diminishes them, then it's worth it. With love and respect, Auntie Helen Stories.